Okay, welcome back. So, what I've actually decided to do before we move to a little more of a complex object is I want to talk about what shells are. So a good way to do that uh, is I'm gonna take my cube here, and I'm only doing this because it's easier for people to understand with a very simple primitive object as opposed to moving to something that's complex. So a shell is basically a group of UV faces. So if I take this cube and I go to UV, I'm going to go up and I'm just going to pull the UV panel off. And the way you can do that, each one of these in the heads-up display, when you're in the heads-up display, if you want to actually pull off a menu panel, you can go to any one of these menu categories like UV. And if you click and drag and hold and go up to the dotted line at the top, you can just let go and it'll actually pull off a panel. So I have my UV panel here. So what this shows me is a bunch of different things. Mainly, it shows me how to, I can create some different projections. Okay, so there's a few different projection modes we can use. There's automatic, which basically projects from 6 sides. So it'll make a projection from 6 sides. Um, There's cylindrical projections, which project around an object, and then there's planar projections. Okay, so we're going to pick automatic because a cube has 6 sides. And I'm just going to click the options box here. So 6 projection planes. So what this means is it's going to make a projection this way. It's going to make a projection this way. So front, back, top, bottom, left, and right. Okay. So if I click apply and I zoom out here, you can see what Maya's doing is it's using these projection planes to project each face. So each one of these faces is being projected in the UV editor. You can actually see that when I mouse over one of these faces. In the UV editor, you can see those faces light up green, okay, on the right-hand side. So over here, okay, I can go to face mode actually in the UV editor. So I can right-click in the UV editor and select face. And you can see when I mouse over, so say I click this face here, it selects this face in the 3D viewport. And I can click this face here. What's that face? That's this face over here. So again, as I said in the last video, each one of these faces correlates to a face in the UV editor. So since we did an automatic projection, it used 6 planes, meaning 6 directions, to project all of the faces of the 3D model into my UV space. Okay? So now what I'm left with is those those 6 planes, those 6 faces being projected in here. So each one of these is what you would call a shell. So a shell is a group of UV faces or a group of polygons in 3D space or 2D space. So in this case, UV shells are a group of UV faces. In the 3D viewport, when we're working with just geometry and we're not talking about UVs per se, that's just called a geometry shell. So it's a shell of faces. So it's a group of faces that are all connected from point to point. All right. So each one of these shells, each one of these is called a shell. So essentially, after we've projected the cube like that from all 6 sides, what we need to go in and do is we need to sew them back together. okay? Because we don't just want a bunch of shells separated like this. Okay, if the cube is one object, we generally want to sew all of those UV shells back together. Okay? So what I can actually do is I can grab a shell here. So this is one shell. Grab this shell and put it up there. This shell over here. I'm just going to separate them. Okay. And I can close down this menu here. So I'm just pulling these apart so that I can sort of see these separate shells and make sense of things. Okay, I'm just trying to make sense of all of this stuff, and that's what I want you guys to do, is to understand what is what. Okay, so I can also select edges of my UV shells. So each one of these has 4 edges. Okay, so if I right click and hold and I go up to edge mode, I can select these edges. And you can see that the edges also correlate to the edges in 3D space. So if I come over here and I select this edge here, this edge gets selected. Okay? But remember, this is an edge. So the edge is actually bordering on 2 faces, right? So technically, if I select any one of these edges, this edge is actually sharing 2 faces. And you can actually see that in the UV editor. So you see how we have this edge selected in the 3D viewport? Well, in the UV editor, it's actually grabbing this edge on this shell up here and this edge on this shell over here. Because again, these faces, I'll go to face mode, this face and this face are bordering each other. So by selecting one of these edges, this edge here actually correlates to this edge here. So what we want to do is we want to go in and start sewing these edges that correlate to each other together. Okay? Until the object becomes whole. It becomes one nice coherent piece. So let's go ahead and do that. So how do we sew this edge to this edge here? Well, there's a few tools that we can use to do that. Okay? I'm just gonna go in. Now again, this is Maya 2017, so sometimes things get a little bit sometimes things get a little jumbled. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that our menu buttons at the top here are all the way they're opened. So if you see that there's like an arrow here, you want to click that to sort of get all of these buttons visible. And a really handy tool that I use a lot is the Move and Sew tool. So what this does, it's this button here. It's the square that looks like it looks like a square with arrows running through it. And what this actually does is it takes one shell and it moves it and sews it to another shell that it's corresponding to. Okay? Or edges. So if I grab this edge and I say, okay, I want to sew this edge to this edge, it will actually take the larger of the two shells, the smaller of the two shells, and move it to the larger one and sew it to the edge. So watch what happens when I click this. Okay, so if I actually take this face and I go to the scale tool, I can scale this edge up a little bit, this face. So this one's bigger than this one. So if I go back to edge mode, and I select this edge here, I know that this edge and this edge correlate. I'm going to say move and sew, and watch what happens. The smaller UV shell moved up and sewed itself to the bigger UV shell. Okay? I'm going to undo that, and the reason I want to undo that is because I want to show you a little trick. If you want to get nicely sewn UVs that don't sort of warp and stretch, it's always better to grab a UV shell by its face. So go to face mode, and if you say, okay, well I'm going to select this edge, and you know that this edge and this edge have to be sewn together, take the shell and move it up to the other one first, just like this, and try to align them as best you can. Don't let Maya have to do the work. And then if you go back to edge mode, you can see that everything is sort of lined up, and I can just say move and so, and it just aligns it really cleanly. It keeps my edges nice and crisp like that. Okay. So if I select this edge and this, if I select this edge, okay, this edge needs to be sewn there. So again, I'm going to take this face and I'll move it up. Take this face and move it up. Okay, I'll go to edge mode. I'll select one of these so these two edges correlate to each other. Okay, so let's find that. Okay, so that's this edge here. So these two faces are bordering on this edge. So we'll go ahead and sew those together. And there we go. So I'll undo that just to show you. You can see that in the viewport when I sew these together, everything sort of lines up perfectly. Just like that. Okay. Okay, so this edge needs to be sewn there. Now, I can just say move and sew, and that will line up perfectly. Okay. So I can do that, and I won't have to worry about warping UVs because these are not different sizes. This is all the same size, okay? So I can just go in, and I'm just going to go in and just say move and sew, and I'm going to be sewing these together. Okay. All right. And you know what? I would rather have my arrangement of my UVs a little bit different. So what if I wanted to separate one of these shells and move it to another place? So I can see that this edge actually correlates to this edge. So what if I want to cut this edge here and remove this shell and maybe put it down here? Well, I can do that using the what is it? Here we go. Separate UVs along selected edges. So what I can do is I can actually select this edge here, and I can come up, and there's this little X-Acto blade knife looking button. It looks like an X-Acto blade. I can just click that, and what that's now done is it's separated this shell. So if I go to face mode, I can grab that shell and pull it off, and I can pull it over here, and then I can go to edge mode. I'll select this edge, and then I'll say move and sew those UVs together, and there you go. Okay, and there we have it. All right. So we can see that we have our cube here, and we've got a nice arrangement of UVs, and everything is sort of nicely placed in. There's no stretching of the checker pattern. Okay, and that's the whole point with UVs, is you want to arrange everything and move your UVs and massage your UVs so that you have nice even projection or projections of your image on all the sides of your object. Okay, so if I had a cylindrical object, on the sides, as the checker is wrapping around the cylindrical object, I want these squares to be nice and square. I don't want them to be stretched or jagged or, you know, weird looking. So if I grab one of these, I don't want this stretching to go on. I want these to look like nice cubes, because again, this checker pattern is just a way for me to check, pardon the pun, if my image, whatever image I throw on there, is being projected evenly. So again, if this is a wood texture, you know, I would be seeing a lot of stretching. Okay, so there's a look at UV shells, what they are, how to make a projection from all sides of an object, a very simple object, mind you, and then arrange your shells back together, sew them. Okay. Now there's one more thing I want to cover, which is arranging the UVs in the proper UV space, coordinate space. So we have our UVs sewn back together here, and this is now, because they're all sewn together, this is one UV shell. This is all one shell. Okay? So if I right click and I go to shell up at the top left here, I can actually select this entire shell. I can go to the move tool and I can move it around. Okay? Okay. Now, again, if I turn on my image, you can see that wherever I move the shell, the image, that actually determines where the image is mapped. Okay. So when we are arranging our UVs and our UV shells, we always want to arrange them in the upper right hand quadrant, which means up here we have 4 quadrants. These quadrants are used for arranging your other shells. I really don't even use these. I'll usually arrange my shells when I pull them off and do my projections. I'll usually project things and pull them off into space over here where I can really see them. And then once I have them sort of arranged, once I do a lot of my sewing, I'll actually pull them back into the upper right hand corner. And this is where we need to have our UVs placed when we go to do what's called our UV projections. So when we're saving out our UV images. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to bring my UVs down here and I'm going to scale them down until they all fit within this upper right hand corner. So you guys have to remember that your UVs, when you're finished sewing your UV shells together again, they need to fit within this upper right hand corner. So the rule of thumb with this is you want all of your shells to be organized in a way so that you're really economizing and maximizing this UV coordinate space. Okay? Because essentially, the bigger your UVs are showing up in this quadrant, the more detail it's going to be in them when you go to paint them. Okay? If my UVs are like this small, obviously, even if I have like a 4K image in here or a 4K texture, which is quite large, that's very high resolution, this is just a really poor use of that space. Okay, so I want the UVs to be big. Okay, I want them to be quite large. All right, so I have this here. Okay, and I have now taken all of the UVs of my object and I've arranged them properly in this coordinate space. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We've covered UVs, we've covered what shells are and how to make projections, simple projections, sew our shells together, and then arrange them in our upper right hand quadrant, a UV quadrant here. And in the next video, I'm going to show you where we take UVs and we save out an image with these UVs on them and bring them into Photoshop, and then we'll be able to actually paint a texture onto this and then bring that texture, we'll save that texture as like a Targa image, and we'll bring that texture back into Maya and then reproject it onto the cube. And that'll give you a look at how all of this sort of comes together and how UVs take a 3D object and make Maya able to project a 2D image onto the 3D object. So we're going to do that in the next video. Okay? See you then.